I thought I understood manipulation after 20 years of guiding tourists through European cities. I'd seen every scam, every sob story, every pretty face hiding a hidden agenda. But manipulation in Thailand, that's a different beast entirely. It doesn't come at you like a pickpocket in Rome or a fake charity worker in Paris. It comes slow, like a fever you don't notice until you're already burning. The worst part isn't losing your money or your dignity. It's realizing that everything you thought you knew about love, about trust, about reading people, all of it, was just tourist-level understanding. You think you're street smart because you've walked 1,000 strangers through the Louvre, but then you meet a 22-year-old hotel maid from Udon Thani, and suddenly you're the tourist. And she's the one giving the tour. If our stories resonate with you, don't forget to like, comment, and tell us where you're watching from. This story was shared with us by one of our long-time viewers. He asked us not to share his name, but he wanted his experience heard. I'm standing in Suvarnabhumi Airport at 53, holding everything I own in 2 suitcases, and for the first time in decades, I feel like I can breathe. 20 years of shepherding tourists through the same cobblestone streets of Paris, explaining the same history to the same glazed faces, had turned me into a walking encyclopedia of resentment. The final straw came when a group of American college kids asked if the Eiffel Tower was, like, real, or just for Instagram. I quit the next morning. Thailand wasn't a planet, was an escape. My severance pay from the tour company would last maybe 6 months if I was careful, longer if I lived like a local. I'd done my research, watched the YouTube videos, read the expat forums. Everyone said the same thing: Thailand changes you. What they didn't say was how. The heat hits you like opening an oven door. Even at midnight, stepping off that plane felt like walking into a wet blanket. But there was something else in that air possibility. In Paris, I knew every street corner, every shortcut, every tourist trap. Here, I didn't know anything. At 53, that felt like freedom. The taxi driver spoke broken English, pointing out landmarks I'd only seen in movies. "First time Thailand?" he asked. "Yes," I said, and the word felt like a promise. He laughed and said something in Thai that sounded like a blessing. Maybe it was. Maybe it was a warning. The hotel in Bangkok was nothing special, 3 stars that would barely qualify as 2 back home. But the staff treated me like royalty, and after years of dealing with entitled tourists, being on the receiving end of genuine service felt surreal. The lobby smelled like jasmine and cleaning products, a combination that somehow felt exotic instead of institutional. I checked in with a young man who spoke perfect English and kept calling me Mr. Colin, like I was somebody important. In Paris, I was just another face in the crowd. Here, I was a guest, a foreigner, someone worth noticing. That's where I first saw her. Plywan was cleaning the room next to mine when I stepped out for breakfast. She looked up from her cart, smiled and said, "Good morning, sir. You sleep well?" Her English was careful, practiced, but there was something in her eyes, not the automatic politeness of hospitality work, but genuine curiosity. She was small, maybe 5 feet tall, with the kind of natural beauty that didn't need makeup or expensive clothes to be striking. Her hotel uniform was pressed and clean, but it couldn't hide the fact that she was probably the most beautiful woman I'd seen in years. "Better than I have in months," I said, and meant it. Something about the way she looked at me made me want to be honest, to tell her about the sleepless nights in Paris, the anxiety about money, the fear that I'd made a terrible mistake by coming here. But I didn't. I just smiled back and waited to see what she'd say next. She laughed. A sound like wind chimes. "Thailand magic. Make everyone sleep good." The way she said it wasn't condescending or rehearsed. It was like she genuinely believed in the magic of her country, like she was sharing a secret with me. I should have kept walking, should have grabbed my coffee and spent the day like every other tourist, temples, markets, maybe a riverboat tour. Instead, I found myself asking about her work, her life, her city. She told me she was from Udon Thani, working in Bangkok to send money home. Hotel work was hard, but better than the factories. "You tour guide in Paris?" she asked. "Must be very smart, man." The way she said it like being smart was something precious, made me stand a little taller. When was the last time someone had looked at me like that? When was the last time anyone had made me feel like my job was important, like my knowledge mattered? In Paris, I was just another service worker, invisible to the people I helped. Here, this beautiful young woman was looking at me like I was a professor, like I had something valuable to offer. "Not that smart," I said. But I was smiling. "Just memorized a lot of facts about old buildings." She shook her head seriously. "No, you very smart, I can tell. You have kind eyes. Smart eyes." The conversation lasted maybe 10 minutes, but it felt like the most meaningful interaction I'd had in months. When she had to go back to work, I felt a strange emptiness, like I'd been cut off from something I hadn't realized I needed. I extended my stay at the hotel, then extended it again. The excuse was simple. I was still figuring out my long-term plans, needed a stable base while I looked for an apartment. The truth was harder to admit. I was addicted to those morning conversations with Plywan. She had a way of making housekeeping rounds last longer when she cleaned my floor. We'd talk about everything: her family's rice farm, my years in Paris, the differences between French and Thai culture. She hung on every word about Europe, asked detailed questions about the museums, the food, the lifestyle. "Tell me about Louvre," she said one morning, folding my shirts with the kind of care you'd give silk. "Is really so beautiful like in movies?" I found myself describing the Mona Lisa, the Venus de Milo, the way morning light hit the glass pyramid. But I wasn't just reciting tour guide facts. I was seeing it through her eyes, remembering why I'd fallen in love with art in the first place. "Maybe someday I visit Paris," she said. "See Eiffel Tower. Eat croissant. Maybe I could show you around," I said before I could stop myself. The smile she gave me could have powered the hotel. "You really do that?" For me, the way she said it, with such genuine surprise and gratitude, made me feel like I was offering her the world instead of just a tour of my old city. I was 53 years old enough to know better. But when she looked at me like that, like I was someone worth knowing instead of just another tourist to guide through the same routine, logic didn't matter, I started buying her small gifts. A scarf from the weekend market. A book about Paris with pictures of all the places I'd described. Nothing expensive, nothing that would get her in trouble with hotel management, but enough to see that smile, to hear her say, "You too kind." She always accepted them gracefully, always had that same grateful expression. "You no need to buy me things," she'd say. "I like talking to you. That enough." But I could see how much the gifts meant to her, how carefully she'd fold the scarf, how she'd trace the pictures in the book with her finger like she was already planning her trip. The conversations got longer, more personal. She told me about her family's struggles, about leaving home at 18 to work in the city, about the loneliness of being away from everything familiar. I told her about my divorce 10 years earlier, about the empty apartment in Paris, about the feeling that I was just going through the motions of a life instead of actually living. "You understand," she said one morning. "Most people no understand what it like to be alone in big city." She was right. I did understand. Maybe that's why I was so drawn to her, not just her beauty, but the recognition of shared loneliness. 3 weeks in, she asked if I wanted to meet her friends. Real friends, not other hotel workers. A group was going to a karaoke bar in Thongla, nothing fancy, just Thai people having fun. Would I like to come? I spent 2 hours getting ready, changing shirts 3 times like I was 18 again. The karaoke bar was loud, crowded, filled with smoke and laughter, and Thai pop music I didn't understand. But Plywan held my hand when she introduced me, called me her special friend from Paris. The way she said it, with pride in her voice, made me feel like I belonged there. Her friends were polite but curious. They asked questions about my work, my life in France, why I'd come to Thailand. I gave them the sanitized version, burned out, looking for adventure, fell in love with the culture. They nodded like they'd heard it before. but there was no judgment in their eyes, just acceptance. One of them, a young man named Somchai, spoke excellent English and translated when the conversation got too fast for me to follow. "They want to know if you like Thai food," he said. "Real Thai food, not restaurant food." I laughed and said I was willing to try anything. "Colin very smart," Plywan told them in Thai, then translated for me. "I tell them you know everything about art, about history." The way she said it, like I was some kind of professor, instead of a tour guide who'd memorized the same script for 20 years, made me feel important. Important in a way I hadn't felt in years. When she sang a Thai love song and dedicated it to me, the whole bar cheered. I didn't understand the words, but I understood the emotion in her voice, the way she looked at me while she sang. I felt like the luckiest man in Southeast Asia. Later, walking back to the hotel, she took my arm. The streets were busy even at midnight, full of food vendors and late-night shoppers, but I felt like we were in our own bubble. "My friends like you very much," she said. "They say you good man." The approval in her voice made me stand taller. In Paris, I'd been invisible. Here, I was somebody worth introducing to friends, somebody worth singing to. "What do you think?" I asked. She paused, looked up at me with those dark eyes. "I think." The hesitation in her voice made my heart race. "I think maybe I like you too much." The way she said it, with such vulnerability, made me want to protect her, to be the man she thought I was. I should have recognized the warning in her words. Instead, I heard only the promise. A month in, everything changed. Not dramatically, that's not how these things work. It was subtle, like a tide you don't notice until you're already underwater. Plywan started having bad days. Days when she'd show up to work with red eyes, when her usual smile seemed forced. I'd ask what was wrong, and she'd shake her head, say it was nothing, that she didn't want to burden me with her problems. But I kept asking, kept pushing, because I could see she was hurting. Finally, she told me. Her grandmother was sick, needed medicine. The family couldn't afford it, and the local clinic wasn't equipped to handle her condition. "I no want to ask you," she said, tears streaming down her face. "You already so kind to me, but I know what to do." The desperation in her voice was real, raw. I'd heard enough sob stories from tourists to know the difference between performance and genuine distress. This was genuine. The amount was small, 5,000 baht, maybe $150. Nothing that would break me, but enough to buy the medicine her grandmother needed. I transferred the money to her account that afternoon, and the relief on her face was immediate. "You save my grandmother," she said, hugging me tight. I never forget this. That night, she made love to me with a passion that felt like gratitude made physical. But it was more than gratitude. It felt like love. Then her younger brother crashed his motorcycle, needed money for repairs. 3,000 baht. The rice farm was struggling after a bad harvest. 8,000 baht. Each story came with tears, with apologies for bothering me, with promises that she'd never ask for help if she wasn't desperate. "I no want to be burden," she'd say. "You already so kind to me." But I didn't feel burdened. I felt needed. For the first time in years, I felt like I was making a difference in someone's life. The amounts were small, but the impact was huge. Each time I helped, she'd spend more time with me, let me take her to nicer restaurants, treat me like I was saving her family instead of just another tourist with a wallet. I should have seen it, should have recognized the pattern from all those years watching pickpockets work the crowds at Sacré-Cœur. But pickpockets take your money and run. This was different. This felt like love. We started spending nights together. Not just sex, though, that was part of it, but real intimacy. She'd tell me about her dreams, her fears, her hopes for the future. She wanted to start her own business someday, maybe a small restaurant or a shop selling traditional Thai crafts. She wanted to bring her family to Bangkok, give them a better life. I told her things I'd never told anyone. About the loneliness in Paris, the feeling of being invisible in a city full of people, the way guiding tourists had made me feel like a robot going through motions. "You not robot?" she'd whisper, tracing patterns on my chest. "You good man with big heart. Maybe too big. Maybe too big." I should have paid attention to that. Should have asked what she meant, why she said it with such sadness in her voice. Instead, I heard only the compliment, the affirmation that my kindness mattered. I was finally someone worth loving, someone whose heart was big enough to make a difference. 2 months in, the requests got bigger. Plywan's family farm needed a new irrigation system. 20,000 baht, about $600. A significant amount, but not unreasonable for agricultural equipment. "I hate to ask," she said, sitting on the edge of my bed, still in her hotel uniform. "But you only person who can help. Bank no give loan to poor family." The way she said it, like I was her only hope, made me feel important and protective at the same time. She showed me photos on her phone, her parents standing in a rice field, looking tired and weathered, her little brother, maybe 16, trying to fix an ancient water pump. The farm looked exactly like every rural Thai farm I'd seen in documentaries. Basic, struggling, real. These weren't stock photos or images pulled from the internet. These were her people, her family, her life. "Of course," I said, "your family is important." The words came out without hesitation, without thought of what it might mean for my own finances. The relief on her face was immediate, genuine. She cried, thanked me, promised to pay me back when the harvest was good. "You no understand what this mean to my family," she said. "My father, he works so hard, but never have money for good equipment. Now maybe we can have good harvest. Make enough money to live better." That night, she made love to me with a passion I hadn't felt in years. Afterward, as she slept in my arms, I felt something I hadn't experienced since my 20s. I felt needed. The next morning, she had to go back to work, but she was different, lighter. She hummed while she cleaned, smiled at guests, moved through the hotel like a woman whose problems had been solved. I was the one who'd done that. I was the one who'd made her happy. When she introduced me to her supervisor as her very good friend, I heard something new in her voice. Pride. Not just gratitude, but actual pride in being associated with me. That afternoon, I found an apartment in Thongla. Nothing fancy, but clean, modern, with enough space for 2 people. I was making plans. The apartment had a small kitchen, a decent-sized bedroom, and a balcony overlooking the city. It felt like a real home, not just a hotel room where I was marking time. I imagined Plywan cooking Thai food in the kitchen. Imagined us sitting on the balcony in the evenings, talking about our day. I imagined a future where I wasn't just a tourist passing through, but someone building a life in Thailand. Someone building a life with her. 3 months in, I got the call that changed everything. I was sitting in a cafe in Siam Square, reading a book about Thai history, when my phone rang. Plywan was crying so hard I could barely understand her. Her father had been in an accident, motorcycle versus truck on the highway between Udon Thani and Nong Khai. He was alive, but in the hospital, needed surgery. The doctors said it was serious, that without proper treatment, he might not walk again. "I have to go home," she sobbed. "But I no have money for bus, for hospital. My family, they have nothing." The desperation in her voice was unlike anything I'd heard before. This wasn't about medicine or farm equipment. This was about life and death, about her father's future. I didn't hesitate. 50,000 baht, about $1,500. Enough for transportation, medical bills, whatever her family needed. I'd been in Thailand long enough to know that medical emergencies could bankrupt rural families. "Take whatever you need," I said, transferring the money to her account. "I'll cover your hotel shifts." talk to your supervisor. Don't worry about anything except your father." The gratitude in her voice, when she thanked me, was overwhelming. "You save my family," she said. "I never forget this. When I come back, I make you so happy." The way she said it, with such conviction, made me believe that whatever we had was real, that it was worth the investment. She left that afternoon, but not before stopping by my apartment. She looked beautiful even in her grief-traditional Thai skirt, hair pulled back, eyes red from crying but somehow still radiant. She packed a small bag with essentials, moved with the efficiency of someone who'd had to leave quickly before. "I call you every day," she promised. "Tell you how my father doing." She kissed me goodbye, and I could taste the salt of her tears. She was gone for 2 weeks. Every day, she'd call with updates. Her father's surgery had gone well, but recovery was slow. The family was grateful, wanted to meet me, couldn't believe she'd found such a generous man. She sent photos from the hospital, her father bandaged but smiling, her mother crying with relief, her brother bowing in gratitude. "They say you like son now," she told me. "My father want to meet man who save his life." The idea of being accepted by her family, of being more than just a boyfriend, but actually part of something bigger, filled me with a warmth I hadn't felt in years. When she came back to Bangkok, she moved in with me. Not officially, she kept her job at the hotel, maintained the pretense of her own life. But every night, she was in my apartment, in my bed, making me feel like the most important man in Thailand. She cooked for me, cleaned the apartment, treated me like a husband instead of just a boyfriend. "You give me new life," she'd say. "Before I meet you, I just working, just surviving. Now I have hope." The apartment felt different with her in it. It felt like a home instead of just a place to sleep. She brought plants for the balcony, rearranged the furniture to make it more comfortable, hung pictures of her family on the walls. Slowly, my temporary living space became our shared life. I'd never lived with anyone except my ex-wife, and that relationship had been complicated from the start. This felt simple, natural, like we'd been together for years instead of months. 4 months in, Plywan had an idea. Why was she working as a hotel maid when she could be running her own business? She'd been talking to other girls from Udon Thani, learning about opportunities in Bangkok. There was a small restaurant for sale in Thongla, nothing fancy, but in a good location with steady customers. The owner was retiring, moving back to Chiang Mai, and willing to sell everything: lease, equipment, customer base for a reasonable price. "I know how to cook," she said, showing me photos on her phone. "Real Thai food, not tourist food. You help me with English. With foreign customers, we make good money together." The restaurant was small, maybe 15 tables, but clean and well located. The photos showed a simple but attractive space, with traditional Thai decorations and a kitchen that looked functional if not modern. It felt like a real opportunity, a chance to build something together. The current owner wanted 300,000 baht for everything, about $9,000, a significant amount, but not unreasonable for a functioning business. "I know is big money," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. "But I pay you back. We partners. 50. 50. You help me start, I make you rich." The way she said it, with such hope in her voice, made me want to believe her. Made me want to be the man who could make her dreams come true. I should have said no. Should have recognized that I was being played like a tourist at a gem scam. But when she talked about our future, about building something together, about me using my language skills and cultural knowledge to help her succeed, it felt like the second chapter of my life I'd been looking for. In Paris, I'd been guiding other people through their adventures. Here, I could be part of my own adventure. We spent a week looking at the restaurant, meeting with the owner, discussing terms. Plywan was transformed during these meetings. She asked smart questions, negotiated details, showed a business acumen I hadn't seen before. This wasn't the shy hotel maid I'd met. This was an entrepreneur with a plan. She talked about menu changes, about marketing to both Thai and foreign customers, about building a reputation for authentic food in a tourist-friendly environment. "You very good teacher," she told me after a particularly productive meeting. "You show me how to talk to people, how to make them trust me." The pride in her voice when she said it made me feel like I was actually contributing something valuable, not just providing money. I was helping her become the businesswoman she wanted to be. I signed the papers on a Tuesday. The restaurant would be ours by the end of the month, but the restaurant never opened. There was always another problem, another expense, another delay. The kitchen equipment needed repairs that hadn't been mentioned in the original agreement. The permits required additional fees that the previous owner had failed to disclose. The building's electrical system was outdated and needed upgrading before we could pass inspection. Each problem came with a price tag, and each price tag came with Plywan's tearful apologies and promises that this would be the last time. 20,000 baht for equipment repairs, 15,000 for permit fees, 30,000 for the electrical work. Each time, she'd show me official-looking documents, photos of the work being done, receipts from contractors. Each time, I'd transfer the money, and she'd promise that we were almost ready to open. "Just one more thing," she'd say. "Then we can start making money." I wanted to believe her. I needed to believe her. By the 6th month, I'd given her almost 500,000 baht, about $15,000. My savings were running low, but she assured me we were close to opening. The grand opening was scheduled for the following month. She'd already started planning the menu, designing flyers, reaching out to potential customers. "You see," she'd say, showing me her notes and sketches, "everything almost ready. Soon we make back all money, and more." That's when I started asking questions. Not suspicious questions, just practical ones. When could I see the finished restaurant? When would we do a trial run? When could I meet the contractors who'd been doing all this work? Each question was met with a reasonable excuse. The contractors were busy with other projects. The restaurant was in the final stages of preparation. She wanted to surprise me with the finished product. I visited the restaurant during the day, when Plywan was supposedly meeting with contractors. It was empty, locked, with no signs of renovation or preparation. The windows were dusty. The interior looked exactly the same as when we'd first seen it months earlier. The equipment she'd shown me in photos was gone. The permits she'd mentioned were non-existent. The building manager had never heard of any electrical work. I hired a Thai friend from the expat community to make some calls. The previous owner had never heard of Plywan. The restaurant had been closed for over a year, abandoned by a tenant who'd skipped out on rent. The business registration papers she'd shown me were fake. The contractors she'd mentioned didn't exist. The permits she'd paid for had never been applied for. Every document, every photo, every receipt, all of it was fabricated. When I confronted her, she didn't deny it. She just looked at me with those same dark eyes and said, "You want to hurt me now?" There was no anger in her voice, no defensiveness, just a quiet acceptance, like she'd been expecting this moment for months. "I want to understand," I said. "I want to know what happened to the money." My voice was shaking, not with anger, but with the realization that everything I'd believed was false. "Money gone," she said simply. "Send to family. Pay debts, help my brother. You think I keep for myself?" She wasn't angry, wasn't defensive. She seemed genuinely confused, that I was upset. As if the lies, the fake documents, the non-existent restaurant were all just details, and the only thing that mattered was that she'd needed help and I'd provided it. "You help my family," she said. "That real, that important. Restaurant just story. I should have ended it there. Should have cut my losses and learned from the experience. But when you're 53 and you've invested 6 months of your life and most of your savings in someone, walking away isn't simple. When you've built your identity around being someone's savior, admitting that you've been played feels like admitting that you're nothing at all." I demanded answers. Real answers. About the money, about her family, about what was true and what was performance. We spent 3 days in my apartment, talking in circles, with her crying and me trying to understand how I'd been so blind. "You think I no love you?" she asked. "You think everything lie?" The hurt in her voice seemed genuine, but I no longer trusted my ability to tell the difference between real emotion and performance. "I think you're very good at telling people what they want to hear," I said. It was the first time I'd said anything that wasn't supportive, the first time I'd challenged her version of events. She looked at me like I'd slapped her. "Maybe," she said, "but I also very good at loving. You lonely man when I meet you. Very sad, very angry. I make you happy, no? I make you feel young again." She wasn't wrong. The months with her had been the happiest I'd had in years. But happiness built on lies isn't real happiness. It's just expensive distraction. "What about your father?" I asked. "The accident, the surgery." This was the moment I'd been dreading, the question that would determine whether anything we'd had was real. She looked at me for a long time before answering. "Father sick, yes, but no accident. He old, have diabetes, need medicine, but no money. I tell you story, you understand better." Each word felt like a small death. The emergency surgery, the grateful family, the photos from the hospital, all of it carefully constructed fiction. Each revelation was like a small death. Her brother's motorcycle accident, a lie. The family farm's irrigation system, a lie. Even her age was a lie. She wasn't 22. She was 26, with a child she'd never mentioned and a husband she'd never divorced. The grandmother who'd needed medicine was real, but she'd died 2 years earlier. The family photos were real, but they were old, taken during better times when her father was healthy and her brother was still in school. "You want perfect woman," she said, "but perfect woman no need your help. Only broken woman need help. You want to save someone, but no want to know what you really saving." The truth in her words was devastating. I hadn't fallen in love with her. I'd fallen in love with the idea of being needed, of being important to someone. I'd wanted to be a hero so badly that I'd ignored every sign that the damsel in distress was actually running the show. The truth, when it all came out, was worse than I'd imagined. Plywan wasn't just a hotel maid who'd seen an opportunity. She was part of a network. Other girls from Udon Thani, other lonely expats, other investments in restaurants and farms and family emergencies that never quite materialized. It was a business, with established patterns and proven techniques. I wasn't her first foreign boyfriend, and I wouldn't be her last. She showed me photos on her phone, not of her family, but of other foreign men. Germans, Australians, Americans, all middle-aged, all with the same hopeful expression I'd probably worn. All sending money to solve problems that existed only in carefully crafted stories. "You think you special," she said, not cruelly, but matter-of-factly. "All men think they special. But you all same. All lonely. All want young woman, think they smart and kind. All want to save someone." I asked her how many others there were. She shrugged. "Maybe 10, maybe 20. Depends on season. High season, more tourists, more lonely men." The casual way she said it, like she was describing her work schedule, made me feel sick, not just because of the money, but because of how thoroughly I'd been read, categorized, and processed. I thought I was street smart, worldly, immune to the kind of scams that caught naive tourists. But I hadn't been a victim of a scam. I'd been a victim of my own desperation. Every warning sign had been there. Every red flag had been waving. But I'd ignored them all because I'd wanted so badly to believe that someone like her could love someone like me. "You hate me now," she said, packing her few belongings into a small bag. "But I no hate you. You good man, just sad man, maybe too sad to think clear." She was right. I had been sad. Sad enough to mistake transaction for affection, manipulation for love, performance for genuine emotion. I'd been so hungry for someone to need me that I'd ignored every warning sign, every inconsistency, every moment when the story didn't quite add up. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now you go back to your country, tell people how bad Thai women are. Or maybe you stay, find new girl, make same mistake again. Most men stay." She left that night, and I never saw her again. But her words stayed with me. Most men stay. I spent the next week walking through Bangkok, looking at the expat bars, the massage parlors, the restaurants full of older Western men with young Thai women. I saw the same dynamic everywhere, the same hopeful expressions, the same careful English, the same transaction disguised as romance. I wasn't special. I wasn't even particularly naive. I was just another member of a demographic. I was predictable as the tourists I'd guided through Paris. Middle-aged, divorced or never married, financially stable but emotionally empty, looking for someone to make them feel important. The worst part wasn't the money. $15,000 was a lot, but not life-changing. The worst part was realizing that I'd been so desperate for validation that I'd convinced myself lies were love. I'd wanted to be needed so badly that I'd ignored every sign that the need wasn't real. I thought about going home to Paris, but home to what? The same apartment, the same routine, the same tourists asking the same questions. At least in Thailand, I'd felt alive, even if it was based on an illusion. I started teaching English instead. Real teaching, at a language school in Thongla. The pay was terrible, but the work was honest. My students were university kids, office workers, people who wanted to improve their lives through education. No one was trying to save anyone. No one was pretending to be something they weren't. Months passed. I learned to navigate Bangkok without looking for validation in every smile, every conversation, every moment of human connection. I learned to be alone without being lonely, to be helpful without being used. The city that had once felt full of possibility now felt like a place where I could build a quiet, honest life. Not the romantic adventure I'd imagined, but something more sustainable. A year later, I saw her again. Not Plywan, never saw her again, but another girl just like her. Hotel maid, maybe 22, working in the same hotel where I'd first arrived. She was talking to a German man, maybe 55, who was asking about her family, her life, her dreams. I watched the conversation from across the lobby, saw the same patterns I'd fallen into. His eager questions, her careful answers, the way she looked at him like he was the most interesting person she'd ever met. I saw myself in his posture, his expression, his obvious loneliness. I could have warned him, could have pulled him aside and explained what was happening, what was going to happen, but I didn't. Not because I was cruel, but because I understood something I hadn't understood before. The transaction wasn't entirely one-sided. He was buying companionship, validation, the feeling of being important to someone. She was selling it. The tragedy wasn't that it was fake. Tragedy was that it was real enough to work, real enough to make him feel better about himself, real enough to give her the money she needed to survive. I'd been angry for months about being deceived, but the truth was more complicated. I'd wanted to be deceived. I'd wanted to believe that a beautiful young woman could fall in love with a burned-out tour guide just because he was kind to her. I'd wanted to be the hero of someone else's story, even if that story was fiction. Thailand hadn't made me a victim. It had shown me who I already was. Someone so hungry for connection that I'd pay for it without admitting that's what I was doing. The scam worked because it told me what I needed to hear about myself, that I was generous, important, worth loving. The money was just the price of admission to a fantasy where I mattered. I still live in Bangkok. 3 years now. I still teach English. Though I've moved to a better school with students who actually want to learn, I have a small apartment in Phrom Phong, a routine that keeps me busy, a life that's honest if not particularly exciting. Sometimes I run into other expats with similar stories. The details are always different: the farm that needed saving, the sick relative, the business opportunity that never materialized, but the emotional arc is identical. Loneliness, hope, investment, betrayal, anger, acceptance. We're like a support group that never meets, united by our shared experience of being exactly who we appeared to be. I don't hate Plywan. I don't even hate myself for falling for it. What I hate is the system that makes it necessary, the economic desperation that turns survival into performance, the emotional poverty that makes men like me easy targets for women like her. She wasn't evil. She was working. I wasn't innocent. I was shopping. The only difference was that I had money, and she had time, and we found a way to exchange them that felt like love for a few months. I think about the German man I saw in the hotel lobby sometimes. Wonder if he's still in Bangkok. Still sending money to save a family farm that doesn't exist. Wonder if he's figured it out yet, or if he's still living in the comfortable delusion that someone half his age could love him without reservation. Part of me envies him. The months when I believed were the happiest I'd had in years. Ignorance, it turns out, really can be bliss. The truth is, I don't know if what we had was entirely fake. The nights we spent talking, the way she laughed at my stories, the comfort she offered when I felt lost in a foreign country, those moments felt real because they were real, just not in the way I thought they were. She was good at her job. Her job was making lonely men feel less lonely. For 6 months, she did that job better than anyone I'd ever met. The fact that it cost me $15,000 doesn't change the fact that it worked. I'm 56 now. I know what I am and what I'm not. I'm not the kind of man who inspires genuine passion in beautiful young women. I'm not a hero or a savior or a romantic lead. I'm just a guy who was lonely enough to pay for the illusion of being loved and honest enough to eventually admit it. Thailand didn't change me. It revealed me. And sometimes, that's the most valuable thing you can get for your money. The students at my school call me Teacher Colin, and mean it respectfully. They bring me small gifts during holidays, ask for advice about English language universities, invite me to their graduation ceremonies. It's not romantic love, but it's real affection based on genuine contribution. I'm helping them build better lives, and they're helping me remember what it feels like to be useful without being used. Sometimes I walk past the hotel where I first met Plywan. The same rooms, the same lobby, probably the same stories being told to different lonely men. I don't feel angry anymore, just tired. Tired of the whole game. Tired of pretending that age and money can buy youth and love. Tired of men who should know better making the same mistakes I made. There's a coffee shop near my apartment where I go most mornings. The owner, a middle-aged Thai woman named Mali, knows my order by heart. We exchange pleasantries about the weather, the traffic, the news. She's not beautiful, not young, not interested in my money beyond what I pay for coffee. But she's kind, and honest, and real. We'll never be more than customer and shopkeeper, but there's something peaceful about an interaction where both people know exactly what they're getting. I've learned to find contentment in small things. The satisfaction of helping a student understand a difficult grammar concept. The pleasure of reading a book on my balcony without someone asking for money. The relief of going to sleep without wondering if the person next to me is calculating how much more she can get from me before moving on to the next target. My apartment is smaller than the one I had in Paris, but it feels more like home. I've decorated it with books, plants, photographs from my travels around Thailand. Real travels. Not the kind where you're too distracted by romance to actually see the country. I've been to temples in Chiang Mai, beaches in Krabi, mountains in Pai. Always alone, always paying my own way, always coming home to an empty apartment that belongs only to me. The loneliness hasn't disappeared. It probably never will, but it's honest loneliness now, not the desperate hunger that made me such an easy target. I understand the difference between being alone and being lonely, between wanting companionship and needing validation. I've learned to be comfortable with myself, even if that self isn't particularly heroic or romantic. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd met Plywan in different circumstances. If I'd been 25 instead of 53, if she'd been a university student instead of a hotel maid. If there hadn't been such a vast difference in our economic circumstances, would we have had something real? Or was the inequality always part of the attraction, the power dynamic that made the fantasy possible? I'll never know. What I do know is that I'm grateful for the experience, even though it cost me more than I could afford. It taught me things about myself that I needed to learn, showed me patterns I needed to recognize, forced me to confront truths I'd been avoiding for years. I'm a better man now than I was when I stepped off that plane 3 years ago, even if I'm a poorer one. The Thailand I live in now is different from the one I thought I'd found with Plywan. It's less exotic, less romantic, less forgiving. But it's real. The heat is still oppressive. The traffic still insane. The food still incredible. The people are still kind, still generous, still willing to help a confused foreigner navigate their country. But I see it all more clearly now, without the filter of desperation and fantasy. I have friends here, other teachers, expats who've been here longer than I have, even some Thai colleagues who've accepted me as more than just a temporary visitor. We meet for drinks, share stories, complain about the bureaucracy and the weather. It's not passionate love, but it's genuine connection based on shared experience rather than financial need. The money I lost to Plywan was significant, but not devastating. I've adjusted to living on less, to being more careful with my spending, to thinking long-term about my future in a way I hadn't when I first arrived. I have a small savings account now, built up slowly over months of careful budgeting. It's not much, but it's mine, and no one else knows about it. I've started volunteering at a local shelter, teaching English to migrant workers and refugees. The pay is nothing, but the work is meaningful. These students don't have money to give me, don't see me as a potential source of funding for their problems. They just want to learn, to improve their lives, to communicate better with the world around them. It's the kind of teaching I thought I was doing in Paris, but never really was. The shelter is run by a British woman named Sarah, who's been in Thailand for 15 years. She's in her 60s, weathered by the sun and the work, but with kind eyes and a dry sense of humor. She's never asked about my past, never pried into why I came to Thailand or what I'm running from. But she's made it clear that the work we do matters, that the students we teach go on to better jobs, better lives, better futures. "You're good at this," she told me after I'd been volunteering for a few months. "The students trust you. They feel comfortable asking questions." It wasn't a romantic compliment, wasn't designed to make me feel special or important. It was just a professional assessment, but it meant more to me than all of Plywan's elaborate praise. I think about my ex-wife sometimes. Wonder what she'd think of my life now. We divorced because we'd grown apart, because I'd become distant and bitter, because I'd stopped being the man she'd married. Would she recognize the person I've become? Would she approve of the choices I've made? I'll never know, but I hope she'd see that I've learned something, that I've grown in ways that matter. The Thailand I live in now isn't the adventure I thought I was buying when I stepped off that plane. It's quieter, more ordinary, more sustainable. I teach my classes, grade papers, help students with pronunciation. I shop at local markets, navigate the BTS system, complain about the rain during monsoon season. I'm not a hero or a savior or romantic lead. I'm just a foreign teacher, living in Bangkok, trying to make a small difference in a few people's lives. And that's enough. It took me $15,000 and 6 months of delusion to learn that lesson, but it's been worth every baht. I know who I am now, and more importantly, I know who I'm not. I'm not the kind of man who inspires passionate love in beautiful young women. I'm not a wealthy benefactor who can solve other people's problems with money. I'm not a hero in anyone's story but my own. But I'm okay with that. I'm okay with being ordinary, with being alone, with being exactly who I am instead of who I thought I should be. Thailand didn't give me the love story I thought I wanted. It gave me something better, the truth about myself. And sometimes, that's the most valuable thing you can get for your money. The rainy season came early that year. And with it, a flood of memories I thought I'd buried. Every storm reminded me of the night Plywan left, the way the rain had drummed against my apartment windows while I sat in the dark, trying to process what had happened. But this time, instead of feeling angry or betrayed, I felt something closer to gratitude. The rain had washed away my illusions, leaving behind something cleaner, more honest. I started writing during those long, wet afternoons. Not for publication, not for anyone else, just for myself. I wrote about the man I'd been when I arrived in Thailand, desperate and lonely and convinced that geography could solve emotional problems. I wrote about the first time I saw Plywan, the way she'd looked at me like I was someone worth knowing. I wrote about the slow seduction of being needed, the intoxicating feeling of being someone's salvation. The writing helped me understand patterns I'd been blind to, how I'd always been attracted to people who needed fixing, who saw me as a solution to their problems. My ex-wife had been deep in debt when we met, struggling to finish her degree while working 2 jobs. I'd swooped in like a knight in shining armor, paid off her student loans, supported her through graduate school. But once she was successful, once she didn't need me anymore, the relationship had crumbled. I'd done the same thing in Paris, gravitating toward tourists who were lost, confused, grateful for my guidance. I'd told myself I was being helpful, but the truth was more complicated. I needed to be needed. I needed to feel important, valuable, irreplaceable. Plywan had simply been the latest in a long line of people who'd figured out how to exploit that weakness. The school where I taught was in a converted shophouse near From Phong station. 3 floors of classrooms, a small office, a break room with a coffee machine that worked about half the time. The students were mostly adults office workers trying to improve their English for promotions, university students preparing for overseas study, retirees learning a new skill. Nothing glamorous, nothing that would make me feel like a hero, but honest work. My favorite class was on Thursday evenings, basic conversational English for hotel and restaurant workers. Most of the students were around Plywan's age, from similar backgrounds, working in tourism because it paid better than factory work. At first, seeing them had been painful, a constant reminder of my own stupidity. But gradually, I began to see them as individuals rather than reflections of my past. There was Siraporn, a waitress at a high-end restaurant who wanted to understand foreign customers better. She was sharp, funny, completely uninterested in my personal life, beyond what was necessary for class. She asked practical questions about grammar, pronunciation, cultural differences that might affect communication. When I helped her practice taking orders from demanding customers, she thanked me politely and moved on. No lingering glances, no personal favors, no suggestion that I was anything more than a teacher doing his job. Niran was a hotel desk clerk who'd been working in Bangkok for 5 years. He had a wife and 2 young children back in Surin, visited them once a month, sent most of his salary home. He was struggling with past tense verbs, kept mixing up was and were in ways that made guest interactions awkward. I stayed after class to help him practice, and he brought me homemade somtam his wife had prepared. It was a simple exchange knowledge for food, but it felt more honest than anything I'd shared with Plywan. These students didn't see me as a potential source of funding or a ticket to a better life. They saw me as someone who could help them improve their English, and they were willing to work hard to earn that help. They did their homework, participated in class discussions, corrected each other's mistakes with the kind of gentle humor that comes from shared struggle. I was useful to them, but not in the way I'd been useful to Plywan. The difference was profound. With Plywan, I'd felt needed in a way that was ultimately destructive. She'd needed my money, my willingness to believe her stories, my desperate desire to be a hero. With my students, I felt needed in a way that was constructive. They needed my knowledge, my patience, my ability to explain complex concepts in simple terms. The first kind of need had made me feel important but ultimately empty. The second kind made me feel genuinely useful. I began to understand that there were different kinds of loneliness. The kind I'd felt in Paris had been desperate, consuming, the kind that makes you willing to pay any price for connection. The kind I felt in Bangkok was quieter, more manageable, the kind that comes from being far from home but not far from yourself. I was still alone, but I wasn't lonely in the same way. I had purpose, routine, small connections that added up to something resembling a life. Sarah, the British woman who ran the shelter, invited me to dinner at her apartment one evening. It was a small place in Thonglo, not far from where I'd lived with Plywan, but it felt completely different. Sarah's apartment was functional, comfortable, filled with books and photographs from her years in Thailand. She cooked a simple meal stir-fried vegetables, rice, fish sauce that she mixed herself, and we talked about the work at the shelter, the students we were helping, the challenges of teaching English to people who'd had limited formal education. "You're settling in well," she said over dinner. "When you first started volunteering, you seemed, I don't know, like you were carrying something heavy. You're lighter now." She didn't ask what I'd been carrying, didn't pry into my past or my reasons for coming to Thailand. But her observation was accurate. I did feel lighter, unburdened by the need to be someone I wasn't. After dinner, we sat on her small balcony, drinking tea and watching the traffic on Sukhumvit Road. "I came here 20 years ago," she said, "running from a divorce, a career that had gone nowhere, a life that felt like it was happening to someone else. I thought Thailand would be my salvation, but it turned out to be my education instead." She smiled, a self-deprecating expression that I recognized from my own mirror. "Took me about 5 years to figure out that you can't run from yourself, no matter how far you travel." I told her about Plywan, about the money I'd lost, about the lessons I'd learned. She listened without judgment, asked practical questions about how I'd rebuilt my life, how I'd found work, how I'd managed to stay in Thailand after such a devastating experience. "You're not the first," she said. "Won't be the last. But you're one of the few who stayed and learned something useful from it." The conversation felt different from the intense, emotional exchanges I'd had with Plywan. There was no agenda, no hidden motive, no performance, just two people who'd come to Thailand for complicated reasons, sharing their experiences without trying to fix or save each other. It was the kind of connection I'd been looking for all along, but it had nothing to do with romance or rescue fantasies. As the months passed, I developed a routine that kept me busy and engaged. Morning classes at the language school, afternoon sessions at the shelter, evenings spent grading papers or reading. Weekends were for exploring the city, but in a different way than I had with Plywan. Instead of romantic dinners and tourist attractions, I visited museums, libraries, local markets. I took photography classes, learned to cook Thai food, practiced meditation at a temple in Chinatown. The temple was run by a monk named Phra Somchai, a soft-spoken man in his 50s who'd been ordained for 30 years. He spoke excellent English, had studied in England before returning to Thailand to teach. The meditation sessions were open to everyone: Thais, foreigners, people of all backgrounds who were looking for something they couldn't quite name. "Why do you come here?" he asked me one evening after a particularly difficult session. I'd been struggling with restlessness, with the kind of mental chatter that made sitting still feel impossible. "I'm trying to understand something about myself," I said, "about why I make the same mistakes over and over." He nodded, unsurprised. "Understanding is good, but acceptance is better. You cannot change what you have done, but you can change what you will do." The meditation helped, but not in the way I'd expected. Instead of finding peace or enlightenment, I found a kind of practical wisdom. I learned to sit with discomfort without trying to fix it, to observe my thoughts without being controlled by them. I learned to recognize the difference between loneliness and solitude, between being alone and being lonely. Most importantly, I learned to be comfortable with myself, even when that self wasn't particularly heroic or romantic. The writing continued, becoming a daily habit that helped me process not just my experience with Plywan, but my entire adult life. I wrote about my marriage, my divorce, my years in Paris, my decision to come to Thailand. I wrote about patterns I'd been repeating without realizing it, about the ways I'd used other people's needs to avoid dealing with my own emptiness. The man who'd married my ex-wife had been looking for someone to save. The tour guide, who'd spent 20 years explaining Paris to tourists, had been looking for people who needed his expertise. The middle-aged fool who'd fallen for a hotel maid's sob story had been looking for someone to rescue, but the person I was becoming, the teacher, the volunteer, the meditator, was learning to be useful without being needed, to help without being a savior. I started corresponding with other expats who'd had similar experiences. Men who'd been scammed, women who'd been manipulated, people who'd come to Thailand looking for love and found expensive lessons instead. Most of them had left the country, returned to their home countries with bitter stories and warnings about Thai romance scams. But a few had stayed, had learned similar lessons, had built different kinds of lives. David was a retired engineer from Australia who'd lost $30,000 to a bar girl in Pattaya. He'd stayed in Thailand, moved to Chiang Mai, started a small business teaching English to rural children. "Best money I ever spent," he told me over Skype. "Cost me 30 grand to learn who I really was. Cheap at twice the price." His attitude wasn't bitter or cynical, just practical. He'd made an expensive mistake, learned from it, moved on. Jennifer was an American teacher who'd been manipulated by a Thai man she'd met online. She'd sent him money for various emergencies, planned to move to Thailand to be with him, discovered that he was married with children, and had been running the same scam on multiple foreign women. Instead of going home, she'd come to Thailand anyway. Gotten a job at an international school in Bangkok, built a life that had nothing to do with romance or rescue fantasies. "The funny thing," she said during one of our coffee meetings, "is that Thailand was everything I'd hoped it would be, just not in the way I expected." She was right. Thailand had been transformative, educational, life-changing, but the transformation had come from disillusionment, not from fulfillment of romantic fantasies. I thought about the German man I'd seen in the hotel lobby, wondered if he'd figured out what was happening to him. One day, while having coffee at my usual place, I saw him again. He was alone this time, looking older, more weathered, but not necessarily unhappy. He was reading a Thai newspaper, marking up language exercises with a pencil, clearly working on his Thai language skills. I considered approaching him, sharing my story, offering some kind of warning or support, but I didn't, partly because I respected his privacy, but mostly because I understood that some lessons can't be taught, they have to be learned. If he was being scammed, he'd figure it out eventually. If he wasn't, then my intervention would be inappropriate and presumptuous. Instead, I focused on my own life, my own work, my own growth. The teaching job became more than just a way to pay bills. I started developing new curriculum, creating materials specifically for Thai students learning English. I wrote exercises that incorporated Thai cultural references, developed pronunciation guides that took into account the specific challenges Thai speakers face with English sounds. The principal of the school, a Thai Chinese woman named Kun Sumatra, noticed my efforts. "You're becoming a real teacher," she said during my 6-month review. "Not just a native speaker who shows up for class, but someone who understands how to help Thai students learn." The compliment meant more to me than any praise I'd received from Plywan, because it was based on observation of my actual work rather than on what I could provide financially. I started taking graduate courses online, working toward a formal teaching qualification. The coursework was challenging, requiring me to think seriously about pedagogy, learning theory, cultural differences in education, but it was the kind of challenge I'd been missing, the kind of intellectual engagement that made me feel like I was growing instead of just marking time. The volunteer work at the shelter expanded as well. Sarah asked me to help with administrative tasks, writing grant proposals, communicating with international donors. I discovered that my years of dealing with tourists had given me skills that were useful in non-profit work, the ability to communicate clearly across cultural barriers, to explain complex concepts in simple terms, to remain patient in frustrating situations. One of the grant applications I wrote was successful, bringing in $50,000 to expand the shelter's English program. The money would allow us to hire more teachers, buy better materials, offer more advanced classes. Seeing the impact of my work, real impact, measurable results, felt better than any romantic validation I'd ever received. The writing project grew into something more substantial. I began working on a book about my experience, not as a cautionary tale or a bitter exposé, but as an exploration of the psychology of loneliness, the economics of emotional labor, the ways people use each other to avoid dealing with their own emptiness. The writing was therapeutic, but it was also intellectually stimulating in a way that reminded me why I'd loved learning when I was younger. I showed some chapters to Sarah, who read them with the kind of attention I'd been craving for years. "This is good," she said. "Not just the story, but the way you tell it. You're not just complaining about being scammed, you're trying to understand why it happened, what it means, how it fits into larger patterns." Her feedback was honest, constructive, the kind of professional response that helped me improve my work. The book proposal was accepted by a small publisher in Bangkok that specialized in expatriate memoirs. The advance was modest, but the validation was enormous. Someone thought my story was worth telling, worth publishing, worth reading. Not because I was a hero or a victim, but because I'd learned something useful from my experience and could communicate it effectively. The publication process took almost a year. Editing, revisions, working with a local artist on cover design, navigating the logistics of international publishing. But the work was satisfying in a way that reminded me why I'd always loved books, why I'd spent so many hours in libraries and bookstores, why I'd been drawn to the intellectual life of Paris, even when the tourist guiding work had become routine. The book was published 3 years after I'd arrived in Thailand. It wasn't a bestseller, but it found its audience other expats who'd had similar experiences, people considering moves to Southeast Asia, readers interested in the psychology of cross-cultural relationships. The reviews were mostly positive, praising the book's honesty and insight, while noting that it avoided both self-pity and Thailand bashing. More importantly, the book led to other opportunities. I was invited to speak at expat meetings, to write articles for magazines, to contribute to online forums about life in Thailand. Not as someone who'd been victimized, but as someone who'd learned valuable lessons from a difficult experience. The speaking engagements were terrifying at first, but gradually I became comfortable sharing my story in public. One of the most meaningful responses came from a young woman who'd read the book and reached out to me via email. She was a recent college graduate, considering teaching English in Southeast Asia, worried about the potential pitfalls of expat life. We corresponded for several months, and I tried to give her practical advice about cultural adaptation, financial planning, emotional preparation for life abroad. "Your book helped me understand that going abroad isn't about escaping your problems," she wrote. "It's about learning to deal with them in a different context." She eventually took a teaching job in Vietnam, where she seemed to be thriving based on her periodic updates. Helping her avoid some of the mistakes I'd made felt like a form of redemption, a way of turning my expensive education into something useful for others. The meditation practice deepened over time. Phra Somchai introduced me to more advanced techniques, to texts on Buddhist psychology, to concepts about attachment and suffering that helped me understand my own patterns. The temple became a refuge, a place where I could sit quietly and observe my thoughts without being overwhelmed by them. "You are learning to be alone without being lonely," he told me during one of our conversations. "This is very difficult for Western people. You are taught that being alone is failure, that you must always be seeking connection with others. But sometimes, connection with yourself is more important." His words weren't revolutionary, but they felt true in a way that helped me accept my circumstances without feeling like I was settling for less. The apartment in Phrom Phong became a real home. I decorated it with books, plants, artwork from local artists. I learned to cook Thai food well enough to invite colleagues over for dinner. I established routines that kept me grounded: morning meditation, afternoon walks, evening reading. It wasn't the adventurous expat life I'd imagined, but it was sustainable, honest, genuinely mine. I started dating again, but carefully, deliberately, with clear boundaries and realistic expectations. Not bar girls or hotel workers, but women with independent lives, careers, interests that didn't revolve around foreign men. The relationships were generally brief, pleasant, undemanding. I wasn't looking for someone to save or someone to save me. I was looking for companionship, shared interests, mutual respect. One relationship lasted almost 6 months. Kanoquan was a university lecturer, divorced, with a teenage daughter. She was intelligent, independent, completely uninterested in my money beyond splitting restaurant bills. We went to movies, art exhibitions, cultural events. She helped me improve my Thai. I helped her practice English pronunciation. The relationship ended amicably when she decided to take a job in Singapore, but we remained friends. "You are very different from most foreign men I know," she told me before she left. "You are not looking for a Thai wife or a bar girl or someone to take care of you. You are just looking for normal relationship." The observation was accurate, but it had taken me 3 years in Thailand to become someone capable of a normal relationship. The teaching work continued to evolve. I started offering private tutoring, developed specialized courses for business English, began training other teachers in techniques for working with adult learners. The income was modest, but sufficient, especially combined with the occasional writing projects and speaking engagements. I wasn't wealthy, but I was financially stable in a way that felt sustainable. More importantly, I was professionally satisfied. The work was challenging, meaningful, genuinely helpful to the students. I could see their progress, measure their improvement, watch them gain confidence in their English skills. Several of my former students had been promoted at work, accepted into international universities, started their own businesses. Knowing that my teaching had contributed to their success felt better than any romantic validation I'd ever received. The volunteer work at the shelter continued as well. Sarah had promoted me to assistant director, giving me more responsibility for program development and fundraising. We'd expanded the English program to serve over 200 students per year, most of them migrant workers and refugees who used their new language skills to find better employment, access social services, navigate Thai bureaucracy. The work was demanding, often frustrating, but deeply satisfying. These weren't people who saw me as a potential source of funding or a ticket to a better life. They were people who needed practical skills, who were willing to work hard to acquire them, who used what they learned to build better lives for themselves and their families. I was useful to them, but in a way that was sustainable and mutual. I thought about Plywan occasionally, wondered what had happened to her, whether she was still working the same scams on different lonely men. Part of me hoped she'd found a better way to make a living, but I knew the reality was probably more complicated. The economic pressures that had driven her to manipulate foreign men hadn't disappeared, and the supply of lonely, desperate expats seemed endless. But I wasn't angry about it anymore. I understood that she'd been working, that I'd been shopping, that we'd found each other because we had complementary needs. She'd needed money, I'd needed to feel important. The transaction had been more honest than either of us had admitted at the time. The problem wasn't that she'd been dishonest. The problem was that I'd been dishonest with myself about what I was really buying. The book led to other writing projects. I contributed chapters to anthologies about expat life, wrote articles for magazines about cross-cultural relationships, started a blog about the practical aspects of living in Thailand. The writing wasn't lucrative, but it was satisfying, and it helped me process my experiences in a way that felt constructive rather than just therapeutic. I also started mentoring other expats, particularly men who'd had similar experiences with romantic scams. Not in a formal way, but informally, through coffee meetings and email exchanges. Most of them were angry, bitter, eager to return to their home countries and warn others about the dangers of Thai romance scams. But a few were interested in understanding what had happened to them, in learning from their mistakes, in building different kinds of lives. The mentoring work was challenging because it required me to be honest about my own mistakes while helping others avoid similar pitfalls. But it was also rewarding, particularly when I could help someone transition from anger to understanding, from victimhood to personal responsibility, from fantasy to reality. 5 years after arriving in Thailand, I felt like I'd finally found my place, not as a romantic hero or a generous benefactor, but as a teacher, writer, volunteer, and generally useful member of the community. The life I'd built wasn't dramatic or particularly adventurous, but it was honest, sustainable, and genuinely mine. The apartment had become a real home, filled with books, plants, artwork, and memories of genuine experiences rather than expensive fantasies. The work was challenging and meaningful, the relationships were honest and mutual, the financial situation was stable, if not luxurious. I'd learned to be alone without being lonely, to be useful without being needed, to help others without trying to save them. Most importantly, I'd learned who I was and who I wasn't. I wasn't the kind of man who inspired passionate love in beautiful young women. I wasn't a wealthy benefactor who could solve other people's problems with money. I wasn't a hero in anyone's story but my own. But I was a competent teacher, a decent writer, a reliable volunteer, and a reasonably good friend. That was enough. The writing continued, both as a form of personal therapy and as a way of contributing to the broader conversation about expat life in Southeast Asia. I'd learned that my experience wasn't unique, that the pattern of lonely Western men and economically desperate local women was replicated throughout the region. But I'd also learned that it was possible to break that pattern, to build relationships based on mutual respect rather than economic necessity, to find meaning in work rather than in rescue fantasies. The meditation practice had become a daily habit, a way of staying grounded in reality rather than escaping into fantasy. Fra Somchai had taught me that suffering comes from attachment, that peace comes from acceptance, that wisdom comes from understanding the difference between what we can control and what we can't. I couldn't control what had happened with Plywan, but I could control how I responded to it, what I learned from it, how I used that knowledge to build a better life. The teaching work had expanded to include teacher training, curriculum development, and educational consulting. I developed expertise in working with adult learners, particularly those from rural backgrounds who were adapting to urban life. The work was intellectually stimulating, professionally rewarding, and genuinely helpful to the students and institutions I served. The volunteer work had grown as well. Sarah had stepped down as director of the shelter, and I'd been elected to replace her. The responsibility was daunting, but the work was meaningful in a way that made the challenges worthwhile. We were helping people build better lives through education, language skills, and practical support. The impact was measurable, the mission was clear, and the results were lasting. I thought about the man I'd been when I arrived in Thailand 7 years earlier. Desperate, lonely, convinced that geography could solve emotional problems. That man had been easy prey for someone like Plywan, someone who understood how to exploit loneliness and desperation. But the man I'd become was different. Still alone, but not lonely. Still helpful, but not desperate to be needed. Still generous, but not naive about the motives of others. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It had taken years of difficult self-examination, professional growth, and gradual acceptance of reality. But it had been worth it. The life I'd built in Thailand was honest, sustainable, and genuinely satisfying. Not the romantic adventure I'd imagined, but something better, a real life, built on honest relationships and meaningful work. Thailand had been my teacher, not my salvation. The country had shown me who I was, not who I wanted to be. The experience with Plywan had been expensive, but it had been worth the cost. I'd learned things about myself that I couldn't have learned any other way, in any other place, at any other time. And that, I realized, was the real value of my experience. Not the money I'd lost or the romantic illusions I'd shed, but the self-knowledge I'd gained. I knew who I was now, and more importantly, I knew who I wasn't. I was comfortable with both realities. And that, finally, was enough. The years that followed blurred together in the best possible way. Not the desperate, clinging blur of addiction or obsession, but the peaceful blur of routine, growth, and genuine satisfaction. I settled into a rhythm that felt sustainable rather than dramatic, productive rather than passionate, honest rather than heroic. The teaching work continued to evolve in ways I hadn't expected. What had started as a simple job became a career, then a calling, then something approaching mastery. I developed specialized techniques for helping Thai students overcome the specific challenges they faced with English pronunciation. The tonal nature of Thai made certain English sounds particularly difficult, and I created exercises that bridged the gap between the two languages. My student Siriporn, the restaurant waitress who'd been so focused and professional in class, became one of my success stories. She'd been promoted to assistant manager at her restaurant, largely because of her improved English skills. She could now handle foreign customers with confidence, resolve complaints diplomatically, even train other staff members in basic English phrases. When she brought me a card signed by her entire restaurant staff, thanking me for helping her achieve her promotion, I felt a satisfaction that was deeper and more lasting than any romantic validation I'd ever received. Niren, the hotel desk clerk who'd struggled with past tense verbs, had been transferred to the international reservation department. His English was now good enough to handle complex booking requests, explain hotel policies to foreign guests, even assist with complaints and special requests. He'd brought his wife and children to Bangkok, rented a larger apartment, started saving money for his children's education. The transformation wasn't dramatic, but it was real and lasting. These weren't people who saw me as a savior or a solution to their problems. They were people who'd worked hard to improve their skills, who'd earned their success through effort and dedication. I'd been useful to them, but in a way that was mutual and sustainable. They'd gained language skills. I'd gained professional satisfaction. The exchange felt balanced, honest, free from the desperate neediness that had characterized my relationship with Plywan. The volunteer work at the shelter continued to expand. What had started as teaching basic English to migrant workers had grown into a comprehensive program that included job placement assistance, legal aid referrals, and cultural orientation for new arrivals. The program now served over 500 people per year, and the success rate was impressive. Most of our students found better employment within 6 months of completing the program, and many had been able to bring their families to Thailand or return home with enough savings to start small businesses. The administrative work was challenging but rewarding. Writing grant proposals, coordinating with government agencies, managing volunteers, developing curriculum, all of it required skills I developed over years of dealing with tourists, but in a context that felt meaningful rather than repetitive. When we received a major grant from the European Union to expand our services, I felt a sense of accomplishment that was entirely different from the hollow satisfaction I'd felt when impressing tourists with my knowledge of Paris. The writing had become more than just therapy. My book about the Plywan experience had led to other opportunities articles for magazines, contributions to anthologies about expat life, speaking engagements at conferences. I'd found my voice as a writer, developed a style that was honest without being bitter, informative without being preachy, personal without being self-indulgent. I was working on a second book, this one about the broader experience of cultural adaptation, the psychology of expatriate life, the ways people reinvent themselves when they move to new countries. The research was fascinating, involving interviews with dozens of expats from various backgrounds: teachers, business people, retirees, artists, entrepreneurs. Each story was different, but there were common themes about identity, belonging, the challenge of building authentic relationships across cultural boundaries. The meditation practice had become central to my daily routine, not because I was seeking enlightenment or spiritual transformation, but because it helped me stay grounded in reality rather than escaping into fantasy. Fra Somchai had become more than a teacher, he'd become a friend. Someone I could talk to about the challenges of living between cultures, of building a life that was authentic rather than performative. "You have learned to be content," he told me during one of our conversations. "This is very difficult for Western people. You are taught that contentment is settling for less, that you must always be striving for more. But contentment is not settling, it is accepting what is, while working toward what could be." His words weren't revolutionary, but they felt true in a way that helped me understand the difference between the desperate striving I'd felt with Plywan and the peaceful effort I felt in my current life. The social life had evolved as well. I'd developed a circle of friends, other teachers, volunteers, long-term expats who'd built sustainable lives in Thailand. We met regularly for dinners, cultural events, weekend trips to other parts of the country. The friendships were based on shared interests and mutual respect, rather than need or rescue fantasies. When someone had problems, we offered practical help and emotional support. When someone had successes, we celebrated genuinely. My friendship with Sarah had deepened over the years. She'd become a mentor, colleague, and genuine friend. Her insights about expatriate life, cross-cultural relationships, and the challenges of meaningful work had helped me navigate my own growth. When she decided to retire and return to England, I felt a real sense of loss, but also gratitude for the role she'd played in my development. "You've become the person I hoped you could be," she told me during her farewell dinner. "When you first started volunteering, you were still carrying so much anger and disappointment. You were useful, but you were also driven by the need to prove something to yourself. Now you're just useful. It's a beautiful thing to watch." Her words meant more to me than any romantic compliment I'd ever received, because they were based on observation of my actual character rather than on what I could provide materially. The dating life had settled into a pattern that was comfortable without being passionate. I'd learned to distinguish between loneliness and solitude, between companionship and codependency. I dated occasionally, had several relationships that lasted a few months, enjoyed the company of intelligent, independent women who had their own lives and interests. None of these relationships developed into anything serious, but they were pleasant, honest, free from the desperate neediness that had made me such an easy target for manipulation. I'd realized that I didn't need to be in a relationship to be happy. The desperate loneliness that had driven me to Thailand, that had made me vulnerable to Plywan's manipulation, had been replaced by a comfortable solitude that felt sustainable rather than painful. I enjoyed my own company, had developed interests and routines that were fulfilling without being dependent on external validation. The apartment had become a real home. I decorated it with books, plants, artwork from local artists, photographs from my travels around Thailand and neighboring countries. The space reflected my personality and interests, rather than trying to impress anyone else. When colleagues or friends visited, they commented on how comfortable and welcoming it felt. The approval was nice, but it wasn't necessary. I'd created a space that felt right to me, regardless of what others might think. I'd started traveling more, but in a different way than I had with Plywan. Instead of romantic getaways designed to create intimacy, I took solo trips, focused on learning and exploration. I'd visited ancient temples in Cambodia, trekked through mountains in Laos, explored colonial architecture in Vietnam. The travel was slower, more contemplative, focused on understanding rather than experiencing. I kept detailed journals, took photographs, read extensively about the history and culture of each place I visited. These trips reinforced my understanding of Southeast Asia as a complex, diverse region rather than just a playground for Western fantasies. Each country had its own history, challenges, and cultural dynamics. The colonial legacy, the impact of war, the pressures of modernization, all of it was fascinating and sobering. I began to understand how my own experience fit into larger patterns of cross-cultural encounter, economic inequality, and cultural misunderstanding. The writing about these travels was different from my earlier work, less focused on personal experience, more analytical and cultural. I contributed articles to travel magazines, academic journals, online publications that focused on Southeast Asian affairs. The work was intellectually stimulating and helped me develop expertise in areas beyond just language teaching. I'd also started learning Thai more seriously, not just the basic phrases needed for daily life, but the grammar, literature, and cultural nuances that would allow me to communicate more effectively with colleagues and students. The language study was challenging but rewarding, giving me insights into Thai culture that I'd missed during my time with Plywan. I realized how much I'd been missing by relying on English and basic Thai phrases. The Thai language classes were held at a local university, and most of my classmates were other foreigners, diplomats, business people, academics, long-term residents who wanted to deepen their understanding of Thai culture. The classes were rigorous, demanding, focused on practical communication, rather than just tourist phrases. I enjoyed the intellectual challenge, the way learning Thai grammar helped me understand the Thai worldview, the cultural assumptions built into the language. My Thai teacher, Ajahn Pornthip was a literature professor who'd spent years studying the intersections between Thai and Western culture. She was in her 60s, had lived in England for several years, spoke English with perfect fluency, but insisted that we communicate in Thai during class. Her teaching style was demanding but supportive, pushing us to think in Thai rather than just translating from English. "You are becoming a real student of Thai culture," she told me after a particularly challenging class on Thai poetry. "Most foreigners learn enough Thai to get by, but you are learning enough to understand. This is very different." Her approval meant a great deal to me, not because I was seeking validation, but because it represented genuine achievement, mastery of something difficult and worthwhile. The improved Thai skills had practical benefits for my work. I could communicate more effectively with students, understand their specific challenges, develop materials that were culturally appropriate. I could also participate more fully in Thai society, understand conversations around me, read newspapers and literature in the original language. The intellectual satisfaction was immense. The feeling of genuine competence in a difficult skill. I'd also started learning to play traditional Thai music, not because I had any particular musical talent, but because it seemed like another way to understand Thai culture from the inside. The lessons were held at a cultural center in the old part of Bangkok, taught by an elderly musician who'd been playing traditional instruments for over 50 years. The music was complex, subtle, based on different scales and rhythms than Western music. The instrument I chose was the hymn, a hammered dulcimer that required precise hand coordination and a good ear for pitch. The learning process was slow, frustrating, but deeply satisfying. Each lesson revealed new layers of complexity, new ways of thinking about melody and rhythm. The music was meditative, requiring complete focus on the present moment, the exact placement of each hammer strike. The music lessons connected me with other students, mostly middle-aged Thais who were learning to play instruments they'd enjoyed as children. The conversations were entirely in Thai, focused on music theory, cultural history, the challenge of maintaining traditional arts in a modernizing society. I was accepted as a serious student rather than a curious tourist, which felt like a significant achievement. These various activities, teaching, volunteering, writing, traveling, language study, music, had created a life that was full without being frantic, meaningful without being dramatic, satisfying without being dependent on external validation. I'd learned to find purpose in work, pleasure in learning, contentment in solitude. The desperate neediness that had made me vulnerable to manipulation had been replaced by a quiet confidence that felt sustainable. I thought about the man I'd been when I first arrived in Thailand, 8 years earlier. Desperate, lonely, convinced that geography could solve emotional problems. That man had been easy prey for someone like Plywan, someone who understood how to exploit loneliness and desperation. But the man I'd become was different. Still alone, but not lonely. Still helpful, but not desperate to be needed. Still generous, but not naive about the motives of others. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It had taken years of difficult self-examination, professional growth, and gradual acceptance of reality. But it had been worth it. The life I'd built in Thailand was honest, sustainable, and genuinely satisfying. Not the romantic adventure I'd imagined, but something better, a real life, built on honest relationships and meaningful work. I occasionally ran into other expats who were going through similar experiences to what I'd had with Plywan. Men who were sending money to girlfriends for various emergencies, who were planning to invest in businesses or property, who were convinced that they'd found true love with women half their age. I rarely said anything directly, but I tried to be available if they wanted to talk, to share my experience if they were ready to hear it. Most of them weren't ready. The fantasy was too appealing, the need too desperate, the illusion too comforting. They'd have to learn the hard way, just as I had. But occasionally, someone would reach out, would ask questions, would be willing to consider that things might not be what they seemed. Those conversations were among the most meaningful I had, because they gave me a chance to turn my expensive education into something useful for others. The mentoring work had become more formal over time. I'd started a support group for expats who'd had similar experiences, men and women who'd been scammed, manipulated, or simply disappointed by the reality of expatriate life. The group met monthly, providing a safe space for people to share their stories, process their emotions, and develop strategies for building healthier relationships. The group wasn't about Thailand bashing or bitter complaints about local people. It was about understanding our own vulnerabilities, our own patterns, our own responsibilities in the relationships we'd developed. Most of the participants were people who'd chosen to stay in Thailand, who'd learned from their experiences, who were working to build better lives. The conversations were honest, challenging, ultimately healing. I'd also started giving talks at expat organizations, international schools, and cultural centers. The talks weren't about avoiding romance scams, but about the broader challenges of cultural adaptation, the psychology of expatriate life, the ways people reinvent themselves when they move to new countries. The audiences were diverse in new arrivals, long-term residents, people considering moves abroad, academics interested in cross-cultural psychology. The speaking engagements were initially terrifying, but gradually I became comfortable sharing my story in public. The key was focusing on the lessons learned rather than the details of the experience, on the broader patterns rather than the specific incidents. I wasn't trying to warn people away from Thailand or cross-cultural relationships, but to help them understand the psychological and emotional challenges involved. The feedback was generally positive. People appreciated the honesty, the lack of self-pity, the focus on personal growth, rather than victimhood. Several people told me that my talks had helped them understand their own experiences, had given them frameworks for thinking about cultural adaptation and relationship dynamics. That kind of feedback was deeply satisfying because it suggested that my experience had been transformed into something useful for others. The second book was finally finished after 3 years of research and writing. It was a broader examination of expatriate life in Southeast Asia, based on interviews with dozens of expats from various backgrounds. The book explored themes of identity, belonging, cultural adaptation, and the challenge of building authentic relationships across cultural boundaries. It was more academic than my first book, but still accessible to general readers. The publishing process was smoother this time. I'd developed a relationship with the publisher, had learned to navigate the editing and marketing process, had built a small but loyal readership. The book was well received, reviewed positively in several publications, and led to more speaking engagements and writing opportunities. More importantly, the research and writing had helped me understand my own experience in a broader context. I wasn't just someone who'd been scammed by a Thai woman. I was someone who'd struggled with the universal challenges of cultural adaptation, identity formation, and relationship building. The experience with Plywan had been specific and personal, but it reflected larger patterns that affected many people living between cultures. The meditation practice had deepened over the years. I'd moved beyond basic mindfulness to more advanced techniques, studying Buddhist psychology, participating in longer retreats, developing a daily practice that was both spiritually and practically grounding. The practice wasn't about achieving enlightenment or escaping reality, but about developing equanimity, compassion, and clarity in dealing with life's challenges. Phra Somchai had become a close friend and mentor. Our conversations ranged from practical advice about daily life to philosophical discussions about the nature of suffering, attachment, and liberation. He'd helped me understand that my experience with Plywan had been a form of suffering caused by attachment to fantasy, to the need to be needed, to the illusion of being someone I wasn't. "You have learned to let go," he told me during one of our conversations. "Not just of the woman who deceived you, but of the idea of yourself as someone who needs to be needed. This is very difficult for Western people. You are taught that your value comes from what you can provide to others, but your value is inherent, not dependent on external validation." His words weren't revolutionary, but they felt true in a way that helped me understand the difference between healthy helping and codependent rescuing. The teaching work had evolved into something approaching expertise. I'd developed specialized techniques for working with adult learners, created materials that were culturally appropriate and pedagogically sound, trained other teachers in effective methods for cross-cultural education. The work was intellectually challenging, professionally rewarding, and genuinely helpful to students and colleagues. I'd been promoted to senior teacher, then to curriculum coordinator, then to teacher trainer. Each promotion brought new challenges and responsibilities, but also new opportunities to have a broader impact. I was now responsible for training dozens of teachers who would work with thousands of students. The ripple effect of my work was significant, measurable, lasting. The income had stabilized at a level that was comfortable without being luxurious. I wasn't wealthy, but I had enough to live comfortably, save for the future, and contribute to causes I cared about. The financial security felt different from the desperate scrambling I'd felt during my first years in Thailand, when I'd been bleeding money to support Plywan's various emergencies. I'd also developed a small investment portfolio, nothing dramatic, but a diversified collection of index funds and bonds that would provide some security for retirement. The investments were conservative, boring, designed for long-term growth rather than quick profits. I'd learned to distinguish between smart financial planning and get-rich-quick schemes, between legitimate investments and the kind of opportunities that had cost me so much money with Plywan. The volunteer work at the shelter had become a central part of my identity. As director, I was responsible for strategic planning, fundraising, program development, and staff management. The work was demanding, often stressful, but deeply meaningful. We were making a real difference in people's lives, providing practical help that led to measurable improvements in their circumstances. The shelter now operated programs in 6 languages, served over 1,000 people per year, and had a success rate that was recognized by government agencies and international organizations. We'd received awards for our work, been featured in media reports, been invited to present our methods at conferences. The recognition was gratifying, but more important was the knowledge that we were actually helping people build better lives. I'd also started a scholarship program for exceptional students, providing funding for them to pursue higher education or vocational training. The program was small, supporting only a dozen students per year, but the impact was significant. Several scholarship recipients had gone on to start their own businesses, attend university, or secure professional employment. Seeing their success was more satisfying than any romantic relationship I'd ever had. The social life had stabilized around a core group of friends who shared similar values and interests. We were a diverse group: teachers, volunteers, writers, artists, business people united by our commitment to building meaningful lives in Thailand. The friendships were based on mutual respect, shared experiences, and genuine affection rather than need or convenience. We traveled together occasionally, celebrated holidays and birthdays, supported each other through challenges and changes. When someone had problems, we offered practical help and emotional support. When someone had successes, we celebrated genuinely. The relationships felt balanced, sustainable, free from the desperate dynamics that had characterized my earlier social life. I'd also maintained friendships with former students and colleagues, people who'd moved on to other jobs or countries, but who stayed in touch. These relationships were particularly meaningful because they were based on shared accomplishment, mutual respect, and genuine affection. I'd contributed to their growth. They'd contributed to mine, and the connections had remained strong over time. The apartment had become a gathering place for friends and colleagues. I hosted regular dinners, book clubs, cultural events, and informal gatherings. The space was comfortable, welcoming, designed for conversation and connection rather than impressing visitors. People commented on how much they enjoyed spending time there, how relaxed and comfortable they felt. The approval was nice, but it wasn't necessary. I'd created a space that felt right to me, regardless of what others might think. I'd also developed a routine that was satisfying without being rigid. Morning meditation, teaching or writing, afternoon exercise, evening reading, or socializing. The routine provided structure without being constraining, productivity without being stressful. I'd learned to balance work and leisure, solitude and social connection, routine and spontaneity. The travel had become more adventurous over time. I'd taken longer trips, explored more remote areas, developed deeper understanding of the countries I visited. The travel was still focused on learning and exploration rather than escape or romantic adventure, but it had become more sophisticated, more culturally informed, more personally meaningful. I'd spent a month in Myanmar, studying the country's complex political situation and rich cultural heritage. I'd traveled through rural Laos, documenting traditional crafts and village life. I'd explored the historical sites of Cambodia, studying the legacy of the Khmer Empire and the impact of recent conflicts. Each trip had deepened my understanding of Southeast Asia as a complex, diverse region rather than just a tourist destination. The writing about these travels had become more sophisticated as well. I'd developed expertise in Southeast Asian history, politics, and culture, and my articles reflected this deeper understanding. I was contributing to academic journals, policy publications, and cultural magazines. The work was intellectually challenging, professionally rewarding, and contributed to broader understanding of the region. I'd also started learning photography, initially as a hobby but gradually developing more serious skills. The photography was connected to my travel writing, providing visual documentation of the places I visited and the people I met. The technical and artistic challenges of photography were engaging, the results were personally satisfying, and the skills were professionally useful. The photography had led to exhibitions, publication of photo essays, and commissions for travel articles. The work wasn't lucrative, but it was fulfilling in ways that reminded me why I'd always been drawn to creative expression. The combination of travel, writing, and photography had created a body of work that was personally meaningful and professionally recognized. I'd also started collecting traditional Southeast Asian art and crafts, not as an investment, but as a way of supporting local artisans and preserving traditional skills. The collection was small, focused on textiles, ceramics, and musical instruments from various countries in the region. Each piece had a story, a connection to the place where I'd found it, the artist who'd created it. The collecting had introduced me to artists, craftspeople, and cultural preservationists throughout the region. These relationships were based on mutual respect for traditional skills and cultural heritage. I'd learned about techniques that had been passed down through generations, about the challenges of maintaining traditional crafts in a modernizing economy, about the importance of supporting local artists and artisans. The art collection had become a focal point of my apartment, a way of sharing my travel experiences and cultural interests with visitors. But more importantly, it represented a connection to the region that was deeper than just living there temporarily. I'd developed genuine appreciation for Southeast Asian culture, not just as a tourist or temporary resident, but as someone who understood and valued the artistic traditions of the region. I'd also started supporting local charities and cultural organizations, not in the desperate, need-to-be-needed way that had characterized my relationship with Plywan, but as a responsible member of the community who wanted to contribute to positive change. The contributions were modest, sustainable, focused on organizations that were making real differences in people's lives. The charitable work had introduced me to other committed volunteers, people who were working to address social problems, preserve cultural heritage, and support vulnerable populations. These relationships were based on shared values and mutual respect, rather than personal need or romantic attraction. They reminded me that there were many ways to contribute to society, many ways to find meaning and purpose in life. 10 years after arriving in Thailand, I felt like I'd finally found my place, not as a romantic hero or a generous benefactor, but as a teacher, writer, volunteer, and generally useful member of the community. The life I'd built wasn't dramatic or particularly adventurous, but it was honest, sustainable, and genuinely mine. The transformation from the desperate, lonely man who'd stepped off the plane in 2015 to the confident, grounded person I'd become in 2025 had been profound. I'd learned who I was and who I wasn't, what I needed and what I didn't, what was real and what was fantasy. The education had been expensive, $15,000 plus years of difficult self-examination, but it had been worth every penny. Thailand had been my teacher, not my salvation. The country had shown me who I was, not who I wanted to be. The experience with Plywan had been expensive, but it had been worth the cost. I'd learned things about myself that I couldn't have learned any other way, in any other place, at any other time. Most importantly, I'd learned to be content. Not settling for less, but accepting what was while working toward what could be. The desperate striving that had made me vulnerable to manipulation had been replaced by a quiet confidence that felt sustainable. I was still alone, but not lonely. Still helpful, but not desperate to be needed. Still generous, but not naive about the motives of others. The man I'd become was someone I could respect, someone I could live with, someone who had something valuable to offer the world, not because I was wealthy or powerful or particularly heroic, but because I was honest, competent, and genuinely committed to being useful. That was enough. In fact, it was more than enough. It was everything I'd been looking for all along. I just hadn't known it when I started looking. And that, finally, was the real lesson of my expensive education in Thailand. Not that romance scams exist, or that cultural differences create misunderstandings, or that economic inequality breeds exploitation. Those things are true, but they're not the most important truth. The most important truth is that contentment comes from within, that meaning comes from contribution, that love, a real love, comes from understanding and accepting yourself exactly as you are. I'd come to Thailand looking for someone to save me from my loneliness. Instead, I'd learned to save myself. That was the best investment I'd ever made, and the most valuable thing I'd ever received for my money.